The Second Age by Maximilian Alexander Paulin. Chapter 1. Ossithur and Brethra. Ossithur could feel the warmth from the liquid pooling near his knees, which was of such a high contrast to the cool night air that it sent a shiver running up to the nape of his neck. The long contorted grimace on Brethra's face only gave him a sense of pride. She was so stubborn and dutiful. She was beautiful also, he thought, and no more so than how she had been the past 2 moons. If this was to be their first child, such pain and blood loss must be a sign. The child must be strong and big. Being of large stature would be abnormal for the Melrin, but would not be an unappreciated trait when it came to fishing and farming, traditional work for the Melrin. Ossithur redistributed his body weight and arched over Brethra in an attempt to avoid the growing pool of his wife's blood collecting in the dirt. The dirt, a heavy mixture of fertile soil and beach sand from the dunes, blackened as the crimson liquid soaked in deeply. The only cloth he could find in the short time that he was given was a shred of what was once a soldier's undergarb. He had soaked it in cool water to reduce his wife's fever, which, like the pool of blood, had been growing since she fell into labor. The once cool cloth was now a hot, salted wad in Ossithur's steady hand. The sweat clung to it and gave off plumes of steam with each streak across her forehead. Yet with all the pain and fever, Brethra did little more than moan and grimace. Ossithur noticed he had been smiling, his cheeks now sore. Brethra unquenched her eyes. "You must stay." Her voice started strong like the command of a jarl and broke the air in the tent with a disorienting effect. "I could not stand if you never met her." Ossithur's mind reeled. Outside of the camp at the edge of the Melagras, 2 armies were formed. It had been a long night for both, and it was an hour before dawn on the 4th day of the moon of Og, 324 of the Second Age, that those armies prepared for their last battle. Ossithur knew this. His people, the Melrin, meaning those from the dunes, had made the great journey across the ocean and settled in the land on the northern coastline. Though the Melrin were an amicable people and wanted little more than fertile lands and good fishing, it had stirred animosity between them and the original inhabitants, the Niduri. Tensions had been ever growing since their arrival. The last major attack had left their settlement crippled, causing the Melrin to flee, and had now been chased straight across the Nord Meller into the vast Melagras, and here, pressed between the great northern sea and the vast grasslands, they would bring battle one last time to their pursuers. "I will stay for as long as I am allowed, and I do not need to meet our child. I already know him." Brethra smiled as his remark, and gave a silent chuckle through her nose. Ossithur was on borrowed time as it was, and he knew that at any point the chief of the tribe would call him to the front lines. The Melrin were of common descent, and as such were shorter in stature than their pursuers, the Niduri, who towered anywhere from 6.5 to 7.5 feet tall, which made the Melrin apt for farming and fishing on the dunes, but added little help on the battlefield. For the Niduri, there was nowhere else they profited more than on the battlefield. Oggithar, Ossithur's father, was not a well-learned man. He had been displaced by the revolts in southern Velagos, the land across the great ocean to the north, and had taken work as he found it, and finally settled on farming as a way to raise his children. Oggithar had told him a story when he was only 5 or 6 years about a great warrior and how they were descended from the great god Audun, whose strength among the gods was unrivaled. It was on this story that Ossithur now meditated. He remembered how his father described the armor that Audun wore, dwarven crafted from the strongest metal and embedded with the most brilliant gems, runes carved into the shoulder plates. To have such an armor now, he thought, that would be a real gift for the enemy. The tent that Ossiter was assigned was on the southern end of the camp. To his direct south was an armory, although to call it an armory was a gross miscalculation. To the eyes of you or me, it would merely appear to be two wooden racks packed down with crudely fashioned iron and stone weapons. All the same, to the Melrin, it was their southern armory. To the north of the living quarters, which stretched up a small hill in 2 columns of tents, separated by a walking path no larger than 2 feet wide, was the northern armory and the chieftain's quarters. The northern armory consisted of 12 racks that had mostly been picked clean, aside from the occasional Melagras bow, which is likened more to a sling than an actual bow, and dull iron daggers. The weapon racks were bare. It was just northwest of the camp that the army now stood, and with the sun beginning to ascend to the horizon, to the east, the drums of war began. Ossiter felt it now. It started as a burning in the tips of his ears. Then came the thum, thum. It was the drum of Adun. The god had seen fit, having seen the ferocity of man, that they should be given a gift special from him, but not any mere trinket. Adun was a monumental warrior and prideful. As such, he built them a drum that when the calling of honor and valor came to the ears of man, those that had the warrior spirit would hear this drum. It would be the drum of Adun that would echo their glory and bolster their spirits. When terror and despair clouded their vision, it was the echo of the drum that called them home again. Ossiter felt it now. Brethra looked up at her husband. She longed for his embrace one last time, but could see the fire that filled his eyes. Having seen them flare, it was only then that she could hear clearly the drums from the battlements. They were calling him. If only she could have hurried, she thought, as if such a thing could be helped, or dear Ossiter could have met their child. Maybe if I stand up, the weight of the child alone would give me some aid. Even the thought of standing sent pains up her spine. No, this was it. Ossiter was going to leave for battle, and she was going to be split right up the middle. Here on this dirt floor, 3 days' travel from any land she called home. Brethra's thoughts then went to her husband. He was going to die. They were hopelessly outnumbered. The Naduri had been bleeding them for weeks. First, a farmer here or there, then a night raid, then a fisherman washed ashore, riddled with arrows, and then that damn Trogrith. The thought made her smile. Ashamed though she was, she never liked Trogrith. He always made her so uncomfortable, the kind of man you feel the need to apologize preemptively for. And what a test of patience he had been for Ossiter. Brethra let the next wave of birthing pain take her away to her memories. She remembered the time Trogrith had made such a fool of himself at Barnur's wedding. Trogrith had been in such a foul mood that the invitation of free ale in the wedding tent couldn't be refused. It also meant that Trogrith was going to spend the evening growling at those outside the tent. Upon Ossiter and her arrival, Trogrith had eyed them from behind his horn. It took Trogrith only a few moments before he was boasting and coaxing her husband by making crude remarks about her ample breasts and the men she had known. Ossiter put Trogrith through 2 tents and then turned around and headed back to the wedding tent. Ossiter had a temper. A gift from the gods, he used to call it. She could remember the look in her husband's eyes. She felt again comfortable, looking back up at Ossiter now. It was that thought, like the first droplet of rain, that started the outpouring of her emotions. Along with the tears streaming down her cheeks, she could feel first pride in her husband, who now faced certain death with fire in his eyes and a smile on his face, who now readied his armor for battle. Then came admiration for her people at the death they would be given, and the valor they would bring to the battle. Then, finally, the thought that had kept Ossiter smiling during his silent vigil. The child was to be born during her people's battle, but not just any battle, their last, as was promised. This concept had been daunting at first to both Ossithur and Brethra. Being born in a battle would certainly earn the favor of the old god, but being born in the last battle of her people, that would pay the highest respect to the god, and must certainly earn something higher than favor. What sort of blessing would a god give for such a rare event? What had her husband been promised? Ossithur looked down at his wife and spoke his last words to her. I cherished our time together. You are a good woman. With that, he knelt and kissed her forehead, pulling a few strands of plastered hair from her cheek, and stood. Instead of donning the shield and his family axe which lay beside her, as was customary for the Melren, Ossithur peeled back the flap of the tent, then turned to look at the southern armory. He moved silently around the tent and took, in its stead, 2 double-sided axes made from tempered iron. Armed with those and his unwavering smile, Ossithur, son of Agathar, of the house of Ulthar, was called to serve honor and valor by the drum of Adun. Keep your honor, Ossithur, Brethra called after him. But no sooner had she said that, did she feel the tremors of childbirth pull her from her thoughts of her husband to the task that was laid before her. The Battle of the Melren was short, lasting only 3 hours. All of the Melren warriors had been slain on the battlefield with some ease by the Niduri battalion, but not without loss. As the battle had begun, fate played its hand. In a battle where the Niduri, admittedly better warriors, outnumbered the Melren by 3 times their number, fate played a cruel trick on the Niduri. Having been instructed to push the Melren out of the dunes, far from the fertile grasslands, the Niduri had held up for 2 days stalking the Melren, then given chase for 3 days. It was here on the morning of the 6th day that the battle was met, under the leadership of Captain Valhume. The Niduri had ridden hard on their horses for 3 days, and would have been well suited to spend the day of rest and ridden out on the 7th day with full strength. Valhume was a mighty warrior. That could not be doubted. But captaining a force called for a tactile mind, and in this, Valhume was a simpleton. And who should oppose me? Valhume scoffed in the Avaskar on the 28th day of the moon of Og. The night he had received his orders. And if they should oppose me, would not my hand be steadied by the axe buried in their chieftain's clavicle? The drink, a simple mead or reduction of honey and barley, had drowned poor Valhume in a pool of hubris. Chasing some dunes, how honor-bound, a fellow captain had jested. After all, this was Valhume's 2nd mission as a captain. A mission to push the Melren out of the lands to the east was no great quest. Who said that? Who fucking said that? Valhume sneered as he whipped his head around. Though it looked challenging, did little more than give orbit to the room around him. Ah, it was me. I said it. It was Captain Orin, son of Bulsorin, stepping out of the crowd that had gathered near the hearth. He was a Nidori that almost rivaled the iron carvings that were chiseled into the shield of every warrior claiming lineage. Orin, who now stood in front of a raging fire, was silhouetted by flame, and now, more than ever, Valhume saw the resemblance. Tell me, Valhume, of the honor of chasing a few farmers of the sea out of the Melagras. Oh, tell us all here, for I am sure we want to hear it. Orin's voice boomed and a dull hush rolled over the Avaskar. Of the valor you will show. You were saying? And was it not your instruction that they should be pushed down south to the Alps? Orin spat in the fire, and a puff of smoke accompanied by a sizzle sent ashes into the air, framing his distaste for the Andvari. Tell us of the might it will take to push some dunes. What is your biggest concern? That the sand will slide through your fingers? I will kill them all! The heavy cloud of mead, an even heavier volley of challenges sent by Orin, had signed the fate of Valhume and the Melrin. Determined to prove himself, and with no lacking of hubris, Valhume, son of Valg, 3rd Captain of Stig Hagir's 14th Battalion, had set in motion events that would have far-reaching effects that only Audun himself could have foreseen. When Valhume sounded the horn for the charge on the Melrin to the east, it was just approaching dawn. Whether from his haste to battle, or fate conspiring against him, or even Audun himself having an ill taste for Valhume's unwarranted pride, Valhume had sent the first line into battle just as the sun crested the horizon behind the Melrin. Streaks of flame and burgundy scorched the skies above them, and blinding white light of the sun shone directly in the eyes of the charging Niduri. And like parchment on flame, they curled under the hammers of iron and hurled stones of the Melrin. On Valhume's left flank, a Melrin boy, no more than on his 14th year, slung a stone the size of an apple, cascading into the cheek of Valhume's left guard. The stone caved in the guard's cheek and dislocated its eye from its socket, sending the guard swiveling like a spun top off his horse. Crazed, Valhume ordered another charge. The second line and remnants of the first line now charged again into the Melrin. Stand fast and hit hard, the captain of the Melrin called high in the air. Though his command lacked sophistication, it was, indeed, exactly what the Melrin army did. A short volley of stones from the Melagras bowmen grabbed one of the Niduri horses. This had a toppling effect on the surrounding 2 Niduri. But the heavy southern flank crashed into the Melrin lines like a wave over a dike. Recover! The remaining front line regrouped at 1/3 its original size. Fill in! The second line, and by the chieftain's count, the last line, filled the remaining slots. Shall we stand, sir, or shall we make them remember? One of the Melrin soldiers mirrored the speech that he had heard only an hour before at Rally. He looked into the chieftain's eyes, but there was no fear in this soldier, none that any man could see. Sir, if we have but 1 day left in this land, should we not water it with the blood of the Nords? And so we shall. The chieftain smiled, a single strand of spit waving in his beard, and a white film had crusted his lips. Prepare for the charge. In unison, the Melrin dropped shield and raised axe, a poor-made wall of honor-bound dead, unwilling to leave this world without one more act of valor. The charge was called, and with that, the last of the Melrin flowed over the hill, and with the sun over their shoulders, broke into the Niduri defensive line. Among these men ran one soldier in particular, the victorious Niduri would later recall. As each foot impacted the ground, a thum, thum of a great drum would sound, and the sweat and blood on his ill-crafted armor shone in the sun like 1,000 gems. The soldier was memorable not just for his appearance and weapons, for he brandished an axe in either hand, but also for his actions that day. The soldier had rushed over the Niduri's left flank and, having taken 2 arrows to the thigh, still managed to jump, using a cheekless carcass as a stepping-off point, and buried both of his axes into the shoulders of Valhume, before getting cleft in 2 by a Niduri broadsword. The Melagras was littered with the dead, as was the coastline from those that attempted to flee. "Did you see the look on their face? How could you kill the great Captain Valhume?" Barker, one of the Niduri, jested, reveling in their victory while scavenging the ground for valuables. "Don't mistake my words. A death of any Niduri is felt, but such as Captain Val..." Barker trailed off, finding interest in a woven garb, but more interest in the Melrin female cowering underneath. Barker's companion was Virtus, a well-bred Niduri by any account, and a true warrior. Unique to Virtus was his mind for mercantilism, which, though it got him into many a tight spot, managed to be his redeeming character trait. Virtus now scoured what remained of the Melrin camp. He knew, with the captain's untimely expiration, also came a chance for himself to find something of value to take as his own. His eyes settled on an ornate shield of iron. "A pity," he said, "that someone would cast aside something so well crafted, especially for a Melrin." The shield would earn him a fair price at the markets, but it was no great treasure. Virtus could hear the whimpering of the Melrin woman that had taken Barker's fancy. "A bit early for that, wouldn't you agree?" "Nah, I earned it," Barker muttered through heavy breaths. "Maybe I'll keep her," Barker said, more to himself than to Virtus. Hearing this, the woman squirmed and clawed at Barker's eyes. "I am sure your wife would be pleased. She can't work the fields, and your house stands but small enough that if you brought her into it, there would be no room left for the master of the house, and he would be sleeping in the rain." Virtus chuckled, very pleased at his sly affront. "No, the only Melrin worth taking would be a good, hardy boy to tend the fields and to carry a heavy load. Pack it up, nothing of real value here." Virtus pivoted on his right heel and turned back towards the Niduri battlements, but stopped mid-stride at a faint whisper behind him. It was less than the sound made by the wind blowing through the great oaks of the Andvari, but yet he did hear it. Retracing his steps, he approached the spot where he had pilfered the shield and began shuffling through the canvas pile on the ground. In the fold of the canvas, he found an axe made of tempered iron, with an engraving on the hilt. "Ulthar," Virtus mouthed. He quickly placed the axe in his belt by his sword and continued to search for the sound. As Virtus lifted the final flap of the canvas, he uncovered a nearly nude Melrin woman with long, wet, brown hair that curled into locks and draped over her breasts. "What do we have, Virtus?" Barker prodded. "Looks like a dead Melrin. She bled out," he mentioned, now noticing the crimson-soaked dirt. Again, a sound emanated from her body. Moreover, a whimper. Moving her long hair aside, revealing an infant suckling his dead mother's right breast. "What do my eyes see?" With that, Barker snatched the babe from his mother. A Melrin babe, and a boy, no less. "Too young to sell, he's of no use." Barker pulled the dagger from his boot and pressed it to the infant's throat. "Bleed you, like your mother." "Hold!" It was uncertain for what reason Virtus stayed Barker's hand. Maybe it was pity at the loss of the child's people, or maybe there was just no honor in it. But Virtus snatched the boy from Barker. "You'll make a fine slave," he said, noting the child's size and examining the sizable hole he'd left in his mother. "And will fetch a nice price when he reaches 6 or 7 years. With that, Virtus cut the child's rear in his left hand, his new shield in his right, and with the axe clanking off of his sword, made for the great Niduri city of Stig Hagir.